Nearly 200 attacks per day were once seen as a sign that Russia was preparing to crush Ukraine's defensive lines during the spring 2026 campaign. But on today's battlefield, big numbers do not always produce big breakthroughs. Russia increased pressure across Donetsk and Zaporizhia, sending infantry, motorcycles, ATVs, and small assault groups into gray zones in search of weak points in Ukraine's defenses. Yet Ukraine did not respond with a loud, large-scale counteroffensive. Instead, it relied on reconnaissance UAVs, FPV drones, small assault teams, ground robots, and long-range strikes to turn every Russian advance into a costly test. A position can be infiltrated, but that does not mean it is controlled. A road can still be used, but that does not mean it is safe. An assault can begin quickly, only to end inside a drone kill zone. So why is Russia launching more attacks, yet still struggling to achieve a real breakthrough? And is the spring 2026 campaign demonstrating Moscow's strength or exposing the limits of modern attritional warfare? Let's take a closer look with military force. Russia entered the spring 2026 campaign with a clear political and military purpose: create visible movement before summer, especially in Donetsk and Zaporizhia. The Kremlin needed more than battlefield pressure. It needed a picture of momentum, one that could tell Russian audiences that the war was still moving in Moscow's favor, and tell Western governments that Ukraine was slowly losing ground. That is why the pressure rose around Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, Huliaipol, and Orikhiv. These were not random names on the map. They formed part of a wider attempt to stretch Ukraine's defense across several axes at once. If one sector weakened, Russian commanders could try to push reserves through the gap and turn a local advance into a broader operational problem for Kyiv. But the offensive did not produce the decisive breach Moscow needed. Russian assaults continued day after day, yet many of them created only temporary pressure around tree lines, ruined villages, and contested approaches. The problem was not a lack of effort, it was the gap between movement and result. Russian units could push into dangerous areas, but that did not mean they could build a stable line behind them. This is where the spring campaign began to reveal its weakness. Russia was spending more manpower and equipment for smaller pieces of ground. In earlier phases of the war, a heavy assault could still threaten to change the map quickly if armor, artillery, infantry, and logistics moved together. By 2026, that formula was much harder to repeat. Ukrainian surveillance was denser, the battlefield was more transparent, and every approach route carried a higher risk. For Moscow, the danger was not only tactical, it was political. A village edge or gray zone position could be presented as progress, but it did not always become real control. Holding ground requires supplies, rotation, communications, evacuation routes, and protection from counterattack. Without those layers, an advance can become a trap instead of a gain. That is why the spring offensive looked active but not decisive. Russia could still launch assaults and force Ukraine to respond, but the cost of each push was rising. Every kilometer gained demanded greater effort, resources, and battlefield risk. The campaign showed that pressure alone no longer guaranteed a breakthrough. It also showed that territorial claims on a map could hide a deeper problem on the ground. For Ukraine, that hidden problem became the opening for the next phase of the battle across several exposed sectors at once. When Russia could not turn large assaults into a real breakthrough, Ukraine began to exploit that gap with a smaller, faster, and less predictable form of counterattack against vulnerable Russian positions. Ukraine's answer to Russia's spring pressure was not a massive counteroffensive. It was a quieter method built around speed, observation, and control. Instead of trying to smash through the Russian line with one large armored push, Ukrainian commanders treated the front as a chain of smaller problems. Each Russian entry point had to be watched, measured, and attacked before it could harden into a real position. This method fits the battlefield of 2026. Large formations are easy to see from the air, and every movement can attract artillery, FPV drones, or guided strikes. Ukraine has learned that a smaller force can be more useful when it moves at the right moment and strikes the weakest point. The goal is not to produce one dramatic headline. The goal is to remove Russian footholds before they become permanent. Reconnaissance drones are the first layer of this system. When Russian troops enter gray zones, they need time to dig, bring ammunition forward, set up radios, and connect with nearby units. That short window is where Ukraine tries to act. A UAV above the area can locate the group, follow its movement, and identify whether the troops are exposed, isolated, or poorly supported. Once the weak point is clear, Ukrainian assault groups can move in with a limited task. They do not need to capture a large town or push deep into Russian lines. They may only need to clear a trench segment, a tree line, a damaged building, or a small approach route that Russian soldiers are trying to turn into a base for the next assault. This keeps the mission focused and reduces unnecessary exposure. Ground robots add another layer to this approach. These systems can carry supplies, move through dangerous ground, support evacuation, or help check positions that may still be mined or watched by enemy fire. They do not replace soldiers, but they reduce the number of people who must enter the most dangerous space first. In a war where one hidden drone or one mortar round can change a mission in seconds, that matters. After a position is cleared, Ukraine's next task is to secure it quickly. This is often more important than the assault itself. A recaptured point that is not reinforced can be lost again in the next Russian push. That is why fast consolidation matters. Troops need cover, communication, ammunition, drone support, and a plan to stop the next wave before it reaches the same ground. This is where Russia's spring offensive faced a different kind of problem. The Russian army could still create pressure across many sectors, but Ukraine was forcing each small gain to face a quick test. Was the group supplied? Was it protected? Could it survive when drones started watching from above? Could it hold if Ukrainian assault troops arrived before reinforcements came in? Ukraine did not need to win every part of the front at once. It needed to deny Russia the time required to turn movement into structure. A soldier can enter a gray zone quickly, but building a defendable position takes longer. Ukraine's method attacks that delay and turns it into danger. Every delayed response gives Ukraine more time to isolate the position, cut nearby movement, and prepare the next precise strike. That pressure makes every shallow advance harder to protect or exploit. The result is a battlefield where control is no longer decided only by who arrives first. It is decided by who can observe, strike, clear, and hold in the shortest time. For Russia, getting troops into gray zones is only the first step. The harder question is whether those troops can turn a temporary foothold into real control under constant Ukrainian pressure. Russia's increasing use of infiltration tactics shows how much the battlefield has changed. Instead of relying mainly on armored columns to punch through Ukrainian defenses, Russian units send smaller groups into gray zones, tree lines, villages, and gaps between positions. This approach can look less dramatic than a mechanized assault, but it is designed to keep pressure on Ukraine without exposing many vehicles. For Moscow, the logic is clear. A small group is harder to detect than a convoy. It can move through broken terrain, slip into ruins, or approach a trench line before the picture becomes clear. It also allows Russian commanders to claim that the front is still moving, even when the movement is shallow. On a map, entry into a contested area can look like progress. On the ground, it may be fragile. The central weakness of infiltration is that arrival does not equal control. A few soldiers can enter a gray zone, but they do not automatically create a secure position. Real control requires ammunition, water, evacuation routes, communications, artillery cover, and connection to nearby forces. Without those layers, the group is not holding territory. It is waiting inside danger. Modern battlefield maps can create a false sense of certainty. A location may appear to shift after Russian troops enter it, but that does not mean Moscow controls the terrain in a sense. If the group cannot rotate, reinforce, or move supplies under fire, the position remains contested. It can become a marker, not a stable gain. That is why infiltration often gives Russia a public image of movement before it gives Russia a usable military advantage. The tactic can create pressure, confusion, and political messaging. But the position must survive the next hours. Ukraine's response focuses on the vulnerable period after Russian troops move in but before they build a stronger position. Reconnaissance drones can observe where the group entered, how many soldiers are present, whether they carry supplies, and which routes they used. This makes the gray zone less hidden than it once was. Once that pattern is identified, Ukraine can strike in several ways. Artillery can hit the approach route. FPV drones can target exposed soldiers or small supply runs. Assault groups can move against isolated positions before Russia brings in support. The point is not only to destroy the first group, it is to stop the position from becoming another assault start point. This creates a hard problem for Russian commanders. If they reinforce too slowly, the first group can be cut off. If they reinforce too quickly, the movement may expose more troops to Ukrainian fire. In both cases, the gray zone becomes a test of timing. Russian claims of advance may hide a more unstable reality. A unit can appear inside a village edge, a trench segment, or woodland, but still lack the tools needed to stay there. Ukraine can turn that shallow presence into a trap by watching routes, striking supports, and forcing infiltrators to fight exposed. This does not mean infiltration is useless. It remains an adaptation to a dangerous battlefield. But it also reveals Russia's limits. When a military cannot move armor forward easily, it sends smaller groups into riskier spaces. When those groups cannot be supported fast enough, pressure becomes exposure. Even when Russia tries to hold entry points, another factor slows the attack rhythm: the heavy mud season of early 2026. The mud season of early 2026 did more than slow Russian vehicles. It changed the way Russia could attack. Tanks, BMP, fighting vehicles, supply trucks, and towed guns all depend on movement. They need firm ground, usable roads, and enough space to maneuver around danger. When thaw and rain turned fields into deep mud, that freedom narrowed sharply. For commanders, this created a difficult choice. They could keep vehicles on fixed roads, where they were easier to observe and strike, or they could risk sending them across soft ground, where they might get stuck before reaching the fight. Neither option was safe. A tank that cannot move freely loses much of its battlefield value. A supply truck trapped on a muddy track can delay ammunition, fuel, and evacuation. This mattered because Russian assaults rely on more than brave infantry. A serious attack needs armored cover, fire support, and logistics moving together. When one part slows, the formation loses rhythm. As armored support became harder to use, Russian infantry had to take on more of the burden. Soldiers were pushed toward Ukrainian positions with fewer protective layers around them. They could not always count on nearby armor to suppress Ukrainian firing points or shield them from artillery fragments. This made every approach dangerous. Ukraine's surveillance network made that danger sharper. Reconnaissance UAVs could watch open ground, road edges, tree lines, and damaged villages where Russian infantry tried to move. Once a group was detected, the response could come quickly. Artillery could strike a route. FPV drones could hit soldiers who were pinned down, scattered, or moving without cover. Mortars could target places where troops paused before the next push. The mud also affected timing. Infantry moving through difficult ground cannot keep a clean formation for long. Some soldiers move faster, others fall behind, and small groups become separated. That gives defenders more chances to strike. Instead of one coordinated attack, Russia often risked sending forward broken pieces of a larger plan. The mud did not create all of Russia's problems, but it made them easier to see. Moscow's forces still had artillery, manpower, and the will to press forward, but the conditions exposed how dependent the spring offensive was on infantry when mechanized movement became limited. Without armored mobility, pressure had to come from men crossing watched ground. That is why the weather became part of the battle itself. It turned roads into funnels, fields into obstacles, and delays into targeting opportunities. A vehicle waiting for a safe route could be seen from above. A unit forced to pause could be marked for fire. A planned assault could lose speed before it reached the Ukrainian line. This did not mean Russian attacks stopped. They continued across sectors. But the pace became harder to sustain, and each push carried more risk for troops. The spring mud season showed that modern warfare is not only decided by weapons and numbers. Terrain, weather, drones, and timing worked together. When armored vehicles became harder to move and infantry carried greater risk, Russia had to search for another way to keep attacks moving. That answer came through motorcycles, ATVs, and light vehicles. Russia's growing use of motorcycles, ATVs, and other light vehicles shows how the battlefield has forced commanders to adapt. Heavy armored vehicles remain important, but they are expensive, easier to detect, and harder to replace after repeated losses. At the same time, Russian forces still need a way to move troops forward and maintain pressure across several sectors. The appeal is simple. A motorcycle can move faster than a soldier on foot and can cross terrain that would slow larger vehicles. Small groups using motorcycles, or ATVs, can spread out and avoid the large signatures often linked to armored formations. In theory, this makes them harder targets and allows Russian assault teams to reach forward positions faster. The problem is that speed is not the same as safety. A motorcycle gives movement, but almost no protection. Riders remain exposed to artillery fragments, small arms fire, and aerial observation. Unlike an armored vehicle, it cannot shield troops during the final approach to a contested position. This is where Ukraine's drone network changes the calculation. Reconnaissance UAVs can monitor roads, dirt tracks, fields, and staging areas before Russian troops reach their objective. A motorcycle moving fast across open terrain may reduce travel time, but it is still visible from above. Once detected, the margin for survival becomes small. FPV drones make the danger sharper. They can pursue moving targets, adjust their approach, and strike when riders slow near a tree line, pause before an assault, or gather near a trench route. What looks like a fast movement plan can become a chase across exposed ground. This also affects morale, because soldiers who know they can be watched from launch point to trench line may hesitate, scatter, or abandon formation before contact, weakening the assault before Ukrainian infantry even enters the fight. As a result, routes that once served as simple movement corridors have become contested spaces. The trip toward the battlefield can be almost as dangerous as the battlefield itself. Russian troops may reach the front faster, but they can remain under observation during much of that movement. Motorcycles and ATVs help Russia sustain offensive activity, but they do not solve the drone problem. They offer mobility rather than protection. They help troops move, but they do not guarantee that those troops will arrive intact. That difference matters more as the campaign continues. Each successful strike also forces commanders to rethink future movements. Russia is trying to use speed to cross dangerous ground before Ukraine can react. But Ukraine is turning the route itself into a target area. Every road, field edge, and staging point can become part of the kill chain once a UAV detects movement from above. These light vehicles may keep assaults moving for a time, but they cannot hide the deeper pressure building inside Russia's campaign. The longer the fighting continues, the more Moscow must confront the wider cost in manpower, logistics, and equipment needed to keep offensive operations alive. Russia's spring campaign became a test of endurance, not just battlefield courage. Every assault required people, vehicles, ammunition, fuel, radios, repair crews, evacuation, and replacement parts. When those elements are consumed faster than they can be restored, the pressure moves beyond the front line and enters the military system. This is the deeper problem facing Moscow. Manpower is not only about soldiers available on paper. It also depends on training, rotation, morale, and the ability to replace losses without lowering unit quality. Logistics has the same weakness. A truck can deliver ammunition once, but it must survive, refuel, return, and repeat the route. Equipment also needs maintenance, especially when older vehicles are pushed back into service. The shortage of armored vehicles has created a chain reaction. When heavier platforms are unavailable or too risky to deploy, Russia leans more heavily on light vehicles and infantry. When those forces take losses, replacements must be sent forward. Each replacement requires transport, weapons, food, command links, and medical support. A failed assault therefore does not end at the trench line. It creates demand across the rear. Ukraine is trying to make that demand harder to meet. UAV operations and long-range strikes are not only aimed at battlefield targets, they also hit the system that supports Russia's campaign. Oil refineries affect fuel supply and revenue. Logistics hubs affect movement. Communication systems affect coordination. Military-industrial facilities affect repair and production. The military effect is cumulative. One strike may not stop an offensive by itself, but repeated disruption can slow deliveries, stretch air defense, and force commanders to protect more locations behind the front. That means resources used to defend refineries, depots, rail nodes, or factories are resources not fully available for offensive pressure. This is why Russia's campaign becomes more expensive over time. The cost is not limited to destroyed vehicles or lost troops. It includes delays, rerouted convoys, repair shortages, recruitment pressure, and the difficulty of keeping several fronts active at once. Ukraine does not need to stop every assault immediately. It needs to raise the price of continuing them. From this cycle of attrition, the war enters a new stage, where victory belongs less to the side that attacks fastest and more to the side that can endure, adapt, and keep its system functioning longer. Ukraine's battlefield in 2026 shows a major shift in modern war. Success is no longer measured only by how far an armored column can move, or how many assaults can be launched in 1 week. The real measure is whether an army can keep moving, supplying, repairing, replacing, and adapting under constant pressure. Russia can still attack, and its forces can still create danger across the front. But Ukraine is making each advance harder to protect and more costly to repeat. Drones, ground robots, long-range strikes, and small counterattacks are turning the war into a contest of systems, not just soldiers. The next phase may depend less on one dramatic breakthrough and more on endurance. If Moscow cannot solve its drone, manpower, and logistics problems, future offensives may still look intense on the map, but they may deliver less real control on the ground. If you found this analysis useful, please like, share, and subscribe to Military Force for more coverage of the weapons, battles, and geopolitical developments shaping today's conflicts. Our goal is not to celebrate war, but to better understand how modern wars are fought, how they affect nations, and why their consequences often reach far beyond the battlefield. The more we learn about conflict, the more we understand the value of stability, diplomacy, and lasting peace. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next report.